How sweet are thy words unto my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path.
Because all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. The grass withers, and the flower falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Now this is the word which by the gospel was preached to you.
At the end of every one of our podcasts, we will reiterate the fact that if you will email us with any ideas that you might have, we'll be happy to entertain those. We had a request from one of our viewers to talk about the subject of virtual worship. They mentioned in the email that this is a subject that continues to come up where they are in their geographical location. It continues to be a problem among some of the congregations and the members in that area. And so we'd be glad to be able to talk about what the Bible's got to say about the subject matter of virtual worship. Welcome to the Biblical Christianity Podcast. My name is Terrence Brownlow Dindy. I'm the director of the Texas School of Preaching and the elder at the BCS Church of Christ. And as always, I'm very delighted to have at my side my colleagues, Brother Mornay Stephanus, one of our instructors at the Texas School of Preaching as well, and also Brother Tom Moore, who is also an instructor at Texas School of Preaching, an elder at the BCS, and also our Dean of Students. And so always good to be with you guys and love your devotion to biblical scholarship and to the soundness of the faith of Christ, brothers. Good for us to be here. You kind of hope that this is a subject matter that eventually is going to go away, but it's not. Doesn't take very much effort to take our minds back about 4 years ago, where this subject was very, very hot and very much on the minds and on the tongues and on the hearts of all of the church, all of the world for that matter. But certainly we want to talk about how it affected the church, and we want to double down on what we doubled down on 4 years ago, and that is that when it comes to the concept of virtual worship, and this is a manufactured terminology. Prior to 2020, we had never heard the terminology virtual worship. This is a manufactured term, but is it scriptural? At the end of the day, removing feelings and emotions, our own personal thoughts from the equation, what does the Word of God have to say about it? And so for our viewer that made the request, we're going to make sure that we tell you and everyone listening exactly what the Word of God has to say about such a thing. One of the first things I want to do is something that certainly we had done 4 years ago and we'll do again today, and that is to give a definition of the term virtual. Whenever we want to adopt this term virtual and use it as a qualifier for our worship, adjectively to describe our worship, certainly behooves us to make sure that we understand what we're saying. So we look at the term virtual, and it is defined. I'm going to give you three different definitions from three different sources. Number one, it means almost or nearly as described, but not completely, or according to strict definition. I just want you to think about that for a moment. Another definition from Merriam-Webster says this: being such in essence or effect, though not formally recognized or admitted. And then thirdly, Cambridge defines virtual as created by computer technology and appearing to exist but not existing in the physical world. So again, if we just take either one of those definitions and prefix it to the idea of worship, that should really be enough to make this thing a deterrent. Do we want our worship to be, in the eyes of God, that which is almost but not altogether, not really what it's supposed to be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about the idea of the purpose of worship. You know, we realize that one of the purposes, of course, the main purpose is to worship God.
Right.
But another purpose is for us to encourage one of another. And you cannot encourage me when you're sitting on the couch in your pajamas, drinking a cup of coffee and eating bonbons while you're watching worship on TV. You know, the whole thing, really got started back with the COVID scenario. We don't want to belabor that point. But when they started that, and now we're seeing what has happened. People got used to not attending. They got used to staying at home. And now it's just so much easier. It reminds me of when the kingdom's divided, and Jeroboam told him to it's too much for you to go down all the way to Jerusalem. Let me make it easier for you. Let's put one up in Dan and one in Bethel, because that'd be closer by. And let's make the worship of God easier for you. And that, in essence, is what they've done with this virtual worship.
That's exactly right.
When we think about the concept of worship, I think also what has led to the acceptance, wide acceptance in some cases, and the preaching of a virtual worship is a misunderstanding of worship. When we think about the word worship, we think about the concept of worship as set forth in the Scripture. Worship is a confession of God's preeminence. We understand worship to be a specific disposition, a disposition of submission. Worship is a disposition of respect or veneration. Worship is a presentation of something. It's an offering of something. And when we put all of these things together, when we look at the foundational concept of worship, just in worship and what it is, and this is true whether it is false worship or whether it is true worship to Jehovah God, when we look at that, the concept of virtual worship does not fit into that category or that description. You cannot make those two, be put together and it harmonize with one another, because you will have to substitute some of the things that is inherent in the concept of worship when you do that.
That's exactly right. It's from a common sense perspective. There are people who certainly would not subscribe to this idea of doing something virtually in any other realm than in worship. We think about a couple that gets married. You know, they're in love with one another, and they go through the courtship, and then the marriage comes, and it's time to consummate the marriage. You know, let's do that virtually. You know, I'm going to go over to my house, and you go to your apartment. We're going to get on the computer and virtually consummate our marriage. I mean, it's kind of a radical illustration, but I mean to point out the absurdity of such. Like you said, Brother Mornay, it's a presentation of veneration to God, and God has laid out for us in the Scriptures what all the meticulous details of this presentation looks like. And the fact of the matter is, some of this cannot be done in any other manner than together with the saints collectively, the way that the Bible tells us that it's supposed to be done.
You know, I think when we're talking about this idea of virtual worship, first of all, people don't even have an idea what virtual means. I'm glad you started this with the definition. But you cannot worship virtually and fulfill what we have in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25. Let me read that for you. Not forsaking our own assembling together as the custom of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day drawing nigh, or the day approaching. There's two aspects here that I want us to maybe talk about a little bit, and that's not forsaking the assembling together, and secondly, also the exhorting of one another. And I think those are two aspects that are very clearly missing when you're involved in virtual worship.
Yes, I think what happened in our society is that we took the concept of the digital age, and we asked ourselves, or rather we didn't ask ourselves, we thought to us, well, let's just go ahead and incorporate this into our practices in normal worship. And we never asked the question, well, did we have God's authority to do such? Did we have the authority from God? Did God say we could do such? You know, there are many inventions in the world. There are many things that has happened over the centuries, many things that have been introduced. Technology has advanced, and yet we remained worshiping the way that God wants us to worship. It is only here, this is really the first deviation from the concept, as Tom mentioned, of Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25. And when we go there and we look at the term assembling ourselves together, it's a complete collection, the act of assembling together or gathering together. It does not merely, according to Word Study Dictionary of the New Testament and Old Testament, it does not merely denote the assembling for corporate worship as a solitary or occasional act, but as a customary act. And so it was, do not forsake the regular coming together of yourselves. The saints were coming together regularly. This was something that was a part of Christianity, them actually convening. as, he says, the ethos, the habit or the manner of some is, the custom or the practice. So because of persecution, because of the Judaism influence, Judaizing influence, some were making a habit or a custom of not gathering with the saints. They were continually or habitually missing services. And so herein do we understand that these brethren were instructed by God in the midst of being murdered. Don't stop coming together on the first day of the week. Where did we get the authority to negate and flat out ignore that passage?
We didn't get that authority. We acted on our own accord, separate and apart from the authority of the Lord. And that's what we mean to emphasize in this podcast on today. And I know that 4 years ago, tempers were flaring, emotions were rising, and people were truly trying to figure out how to navigate this pandemic, which was something that was all new to us. There's been epidemics, but this was a pandemic, and this is something that's all new. As obviously was a strand of COVID that was all new, and so everybody was trying to get things figured out. But as high as the emotions and tensions were, what Brother Mornay says has got to be at the forefront of our minds as children of God always. Is there authority? I don't care how we feel or what's going on, what the circumstances may dictate. Is there authority from God? It's always got to be the final question that is asked and answered in anything that we do in matters of religion or anything else. We think about Acts chapter 2 in verse number 42, and you're talking about that it was customary, it was a perpetual, it was perceptual, the assembling together, the saints. And Acts chapter 2, verse number 42, Luke definitely impresses this upon our minds as he talks about the newly formed church of Christ. And he says they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and breaking of bread and in prayers. And so those are worship items. And Luke is telling us that the church continued perceptually, perpetually in these things.
You know, I think also with regard to the virtual worship, as you mentioned, one of the aspects of worship that we're involved in is the Lord's Supper.
Sure.
And we have very clear example, very vivid proof that this was to be done together. You think about in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, we have a divine example where they gathered together to do this very thing. When you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 to 33, we also have a clear idea here, a command that they came together. Just look at in verse 17, the context of the passage is when you come together. And verse 18, Paul continues, when you come together as a church. In verse 20, Paul continues, when you come together. And constantly throughout this is an item of people coming together to partake of the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. I have seen where people in this, they would be airing their worship service on Facebook and say, like us if you're on the air so we can be encouraged. Yeah. Well, like that's really going to be an encouragement, right?
Yeah. When I think about this concept of virtual worship, if you go back to some of the issues that the Lord's Church has faced over the years, and we see how slowly but surely Satan has made its inroads into the minds of brethren. We think about the concept of house churches. Are those who are advocating for virtual worship, will they advocate also for the concept of a broken up congregation meeting in homes? Mm-hmm. You think of children's church. We think of where we're separating or dividing the assembly, and one going one way and one the other way. Well, if virtual worship, which is a divided assembly, if that essentially is permitted, then house churches are permitted. Then children's church is permitted. And these are things that we have stood against for a very long time, and we know that these are not biblical practices, and those who advocate for children's church and house churches have not studied the Scriptures, or rather are deviant in their actions. And so when we consider what has happened, we have to ascertain that not only have we allowed certain things to creep into the church, as we talked about authority, not thinking about authority, but it's a long-standing practice that we now are willing to throw by the wayside. And when we do that, the consequence of that is we now we must then allow other things which we stood against in the past.
That's right, to be consistent. You talk about standing against other things in the past. I'm telling you, I know it. I've been a minister. You guys have as well for decades, and we've been in the Lord's church for even longer. And I've seen men be rebuked in the Lord's church in times past for thinking that it was permissible for me to forsake the assembling of the saints, to go out on my boat and fish while the saints are assembling.
Correct.
And I've literally stood in the presence of men who said, well, we've got the communion with us. We're going to take the Lord's Supper out on the boat. And man, I'm telling you, it makes you just scratch your head. The fact that someone thinks that is perfectly acceptable. The fact of the matter is, prior to 2020, we didn't think it was acceptable. We didn't think it's acceptable. And so what you're hitting on, Brother Mornay, is the lack of consistency that has become problematic, that sometimes we wanted to sweep under the rug in trying to promote this virtual worship thing. But so many elders and so many preachers in the Lord's church jumped on board with trying to validate this idea of virtual worship. The same preachers who I know for a fact would have, prior to 2020, absolutely rebuked a brother or sister who thought that it was acceptable to skip worship services to go fish under with the idea that I can take the Lord's Supper out on the boat, separate and apart from the Lord's church.
Mm-hmm. You know, the idea of virtual worship with regard to making the church strong or weak has to be considered.
Yes, sir.
When you think about back in Hebrews 10, verse 25, where it says, not forsaking your assembling together, okay, that's a command, but why? I think that's important in this also, because it says, but exhorting one another. And you look at the churches during the pandemic and how many of them are really hitting hardship right now because of this virtual worship, and we don't want to meet together. How many congregations have dropped in number drastically? How many have now no longer have the contribution they once had so they can support missionaries and this and that?
Yeah, brother, when you study this stuff, and I have to for some of the work that I'm doing, church growth and the trends pre and post COVID, it is almost unanimous. Preachers belly aching, pastors of denominational churches belly aching, but this is not just among denominationalism, this is in the church as well, complaining that our post-COVID numbers are nowhere near our pre-COVID numbers. We have lost our members. We cannot get them back. You know, the reason why is because you told them that it was authorized for them to do something that it was not authorized for them to do. You tell people who don't really want to be at worship anyway, well, that you really don't have to come. You can stay home in your pajamas and do it. Then what is going to happen, man? This thing just should not have been a surprise to us.
Yeah.
It shouldn't have been surprising. Here's something that is heartbreaking. It's fresh in my mind because for a sermon I had to preach a little bit ago, I was looking at the story all over again. But in the Washington Stand, there was an article a few months ago about Calvary Chapel. This is the denomination out in California, and you may be familiar with it. This is a denomination that ended up being fined by the government, with Gavin Newsom leading the charge and the DA and these other people leading the charge, were fined $3.2 million for continuing to assemble whenever the authorities of California were telling them not to, forbidding them from assembling. And so they continued to assemble. That their pastor led them and told the members, and he even put out a YouTube video. I watched it myself, where he's telling his members, you come, you assemble, and if anybody goes to jail, I'll go to jail. If there's any fines to be paid, I'll pay it out of my own pocket. You come and assemble, because that's what the Lord expects of us. Now, this is a denomination. It's not the Lord's church. I'm telling you, it's a thing of shame when you got a denomination that stood like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas so many members of the Lord's church folded, knowing that we know what the Word of God has to say about this matter. At the end of the day, they were going through settling the court cases. The reason why the Washington Stand was carrying the article, and that Calvary Chapel, they won. And so all the 3.8 million or 2 million, whatever it was, in fines was overturned. They didn't have to pay that. And they said, one of the things that the article says is that their membership has increased 5 times because they were willing to stand. They boast of a 3,000 membership congregation right now, and it's because they stood instead of folding.
Well, you know, you can look at BCS. BCS did not shut their doors.
Yes, indeed.
And now we're busting at the seams.
That's exactly
where
right.
I've seen other congregations where now they are struggling mightily to try to keep their doors open.
Yeah, when you think about worship on the first day of the week, I think when we talk about virtual worship, I think the main contention when we talk about virtual worship, or the main talking point of those who like to advocate it, is the Lord's Supper. It's the idea that we can't observe the Lord's Supper separate and apart from one another. But when you look at the text, when you look at the worship that is commanded, there's one type of worship commanded and approved in Scripture. There has to be. And that worship is on the first day of the week. But some are arguing that taking the Lord's Supper online is the same as taking it together, right? So taking the Lord's Supper online is the same as taking it together. That's the argument that's being made for online worship. Well, and that's patently false, because the same people who argue for years against the divided assembly are now arguing for a divided assembly. But notice Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart on the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. If we are willing to get rid of the part that says they came together, what's stopping us from getting rid of the first day of the week? It's in the same sentence. And so the main verb phrase in the sentence is Paul preached. When we look at the adverbial phrases, the when or the how or the why, the sentence, and then ask the question, he preached on the first day of the week. He preached when the disciples came together. He preached when they came together for the purpose of breaking bread. And so the word to then is a preposition which explains to us the purpose or the intention. The purpose the disciples were gathering was to break bread. And so the Apostle Paul would say the same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 and 20. When you come together, in verse 20 says, when you come together therefore into one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. That was a rebuke, which tells us you should have been coming together to eat the Lord's Supper.
That's right.
And so herein do we see the greatest dilemma. You cannot observe the Lord's memorial as a divided assembly. And I think for years, people understood that, because here's what they would do in a divided assembly. They would sing, they would then observe the Lord's Supper, and then they would disperse. They would have their children's church, because they understood the concept that the Lord's Supper has to be eaten together. But now, we've thrown that out of the window completely.
That's such a good point. And not only that, but when you think about the expectations from above where our worshipful song is concerned, there's some problems there as well, right? Because when we look in places like the book of Ephesians chapter 5, verse number 19, and Colossians 3, verse number 16, both of those will use the reciprocal pronouns, hail, tois, or something of that nature, to talk about the fact that our singing is to be done together, one to another, to be reciprocal, and it's for the purpose of, in Colossians 3:16, edifying and admonishing and teaching one another. And so how can I teach you in song when I'm at my address 23 miles away, Brother Tom, from where you live? You're in your home, I'm in my home. We can't edify each other through song. We can't admonish one another through song. We can't teach one another through song when we cannot hear one another sing.
You know, I think about, again, in connection with all this, back in Hebrews 10:25, don't forsake the assembling together, as the custom, the habit of some are doing now, but exhorting one another. And then he says, and so much the more as you see the day drawing nigh. Now there's, different views as to what that exactly means. Some think it means Sunday, or the day of judgment, or day of one's death, or the destruction of Jerusalem. Right. But any one of those things tells you the importance of, while you have the opportunity, while you're alive, you better be encouraging one another. And there is no encouraging when you're not in the assembly. You just can't do it.
That's exactly right. You look at so many times when people fall away from the faith, and the age-old illustration is of the embers. When you got embers, or maybe a pile of charcoal here, and as long as it's together, all the embers are glowing red. They're hot and glowing red. You just take one with a set of tongs and you move it out to the side away from the rest of them. It's only going to be a matter of minutes before that thing cools off and becomes totally ineffective to accomplish what it's designed to accomplish.
You know, when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14, at the end of the chapter, where clearly the Apostle Paul says, let all things be done decently and in order. And I want us to go back to the concept of singing. I want to look at the concept of singing. I've seen in some congregations where they have the timer or at least the computer on there, and they look at the computer and the sound is on. It's confusion. It doesn't, it does not only not doesn't sound good, it's not right. I think anybody in their right mind looking at that situation can honestly say, I've sat in one a service where individuals, and we were visiting somewhere, and I saw this is the setup they had, and somebody is walking by in their pajamas, and we're talking about worshiping Jehovah God. And you're sitting in your pajamas in front of your computer screen, and you think that is acceptable to give to Jehovah God. If Nadab and Abihu couldn't even offer up strange fire which God had commanded them not, what makes you think you can offer up worship to God in your pajamas and that He'd be pleased with that? I think we've lost our mind completely. Those who are honest with themselves have to look at this concept of, what am I giving to God? Is this decent? Is it decorous? Is it beautiful? No. What I'm doing is I'm doing as little as possible. I'm doing as much as I can get away with. And another thing I think we need to consider in relation to worship. Worship is the coming together on the first day of the week is the defining tenet of Christianity. It is the description of Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25. How were Christians identified? It were identified by them coming together on the first day of the week for the memorial of the Lord. If you take that away and it is no longer necessary for us to come together on the first day of the week, then why not close down our buildings? Right. If it's okay for you to worship virtually, then it's okay for everyone to worship virtually. Close down the buildings, sell it, and let's all just sit at home and worship on our computers.
That's it, man.
You know, I think one thing that we might need to address with this virtual worship and people staying at home and watching on TV, there's two groups of people that are not in services. There's one group that would just rather stay home and watch it on TV, and there's another group that's sick and cannot go.
Yes, sir.
And so I think we need to make a distinction. We're talking about two different types of people here. And most of the people, or say, I don't know if I can say most, but there's a lot of people who are home and could be there.
Right. So, Brother Tom, that is a very, very good point, one that warrants our attention here toward the end of our time. And so we'll discuss it. That's exactly right. And at the end of the day, it's going to be something that's going to be between them and God, because I don't know your heart. I don't know what's in your mind. I can't feel what's going on in your body. So I can't verify whether or not you're really sick or not. That is going to be something that you're going to have to be honest about. But understand this, and I had this conversation just the other day. Sick or not, you still cannot do certain acts of worship separate and apart from the assembly. Exactly. So with that being said, this habit of taking the communion to those who are sick and shut in is equally as unauthorized.
In fact, that is Catholic in nature. In fact, it's a product of Catholicism. The concept of taking the Lord's Supper. You cannot take the Lord's Supper separate and apart from the congregation. It is inherent in the command for us to take it together.
Yeah, some people treat it like a sacrament.
Yes,
you know, and where they're in the hospital, let's go take them the Lord's Supper. Well, you know, we used to other places I've been, we would go to the nursing home, but we would provide them the full worship.
Yeah,
and that congregation in that place, they could partake. We sang with them, we talked to, we preached to them, and so that's different than just taking the Lord's Supper by itself and maybe singing a song.
Yeah, glad you mentioned that. We did the same in Kendall, Louisiana, whenever I labored there. There was a congregation in the nursing home. We had several members there, formulated a congregation because we had several members there, and we would go after we worshiped with the Kendall Church of Christ, and we'd go worship with the congregation at the nursing home as well. Like you said, the full, complete, comprehensive act of worship going on. And so again, you know, we just got to make sure as we close here that we get away from our feelings and emotions, get outside the realm of our opinions and what we think, because that's what the church was suffering from 4 years ago, is everybody wanting to insert what they think, how they felt, And I understand that the pandemic was an extremely volatile and vulnerable situation. I know good people who passed away from COVID-19, people that I loved. I got preacher friends that I loved that passed away from COVID-19. I myself was in the hospital for 6 days, not thinking that I was going to make it out of there with COVID-19. But be that as it may, none of that negates the facts that we've brought forth today. What we do in matters of worship have to be in accordance with the authority of God, and if it's not, then we ought not to be doing it.
You have not yet resisted unto blood.
That's exactly right, exactly right. So that would be another whole podcast to talk about the comparison between what they went through in that day, and there was no authorization for them to not assemble, versus what we go through today. So glad that you joined us today on the Biblical Christianity Podcast. We always cherish you being with us. Again, our email address is on the screen. If you have any questions about today's episode, any comments that you'd like to make, any suggestions, today's episode was a result of a suggestion that was made for us, then please, by all means, email us. We'd love to be able to read and respond to that. Until next time, thank you.